Welcome GRD131, Graphic Design 1. And what we're going to go over in this video is critiquing. We're going to look at design principles, the HAUS design principles and the ECBARF design principles, and maybe some others. And we're going to use them to help us critique a design. And the design that we're going to look at is a package design. It's packaging for gluten-free cheddar cheese sandwich crackers. Now, I've had these, and I took a picture of the box that was sitting on our kitchen table, because I thought it was a nice design, and we'll talk about why it's a nice design and if there's any negative things about it as well. But I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of go over how to critique, because critiquing is not about saying I like this or this is nice and I don't like this and this looks stupid and I like that. It's about kind of looking at the purpose of what they're trying to do with the design and seeing if they're effective, and are they effective by employing design principles. So we're going to look at those design principles, and if you ever don't know where to start with the purpose. What are they trying to do here? Because if they're accomplishing it, then they're doing the right thing, no matter how they did it. And then two, if you're just looking at design, look at how they're using the design principles. You can't just identify them and say, oh yeah, they're using contrast. You have to look and say, how are they using contrast? How are they employing emphasis? How are they using alignment? How is flow working? Is it effective? Is it taking your eye to the right area of the design? So all that kind of stuff we're going to look at. So we're going to start with HAUS, which is HAUS. That's the one from the Robin Landa book. That's hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. And then there's also ECBARF, which is from the Basics of Design book, which is emphasis, contrast, which they go together, balance, alignment, which we already mentioned, and then repetition, which is very important, and flow, which is very important. And then we'll also talk about proximity, which isn't in those, but it's also another design principle. So there's a lot of things we're going to look at here, and some of them will relate to the others. But again, our first thing we want to look at is what is the purpose here. Their packaging wants to attract people on a gluten-free diet, because a lot of times they don't have a lot of great options. Although when it comes to crackers and things, sometimes it doesn't even matter. Sometimes this stuff doesn't have wheat in it. Gluten-free usually means it's without wheat because people have sensitivities towards it. So obviously they're really focusing on that more than anything. I mean, the company is Lance. So you've probably seen that name before. They make little snacky stuff, but they're the company, but the brand of crackers here is gluten-free is the name that's really standing out. It's almost like a logo. And I thought gluten-free was just, like fat-free or something. You wouldn't see a product that said fat-free really big like that. But they're really pushing gluten-free on this product so that you attract that market. So it stands out. If you see that on a shelf, you're like, oh, I can't get any of these crackers. And then you're like, oh, gluten-free, cheddar cheese, real cheddar cheese. I'll take those. So let's break this down a little bit. If we look at HAUS, H-A-U-S, and we talk about hierarchy, what's the most important thing here? Well, based on it, you could see the gluten-free is number 1. Cheddar cheese, I guess, is kind of number 2. And the crackers are kind of number 3. Although it's hard to tell because they're all kind of grouped together. But we know gluten-free is number 1. Cheddar cheese and the actual crackers themselves are like number 2. And the logo is kind of next, and bite-sized sandwich crackers at the bottom you could barely read it. They put it in a light brown over a dark brown. It's very hard to read, so that's obviously not very important. So in terms of hierarchy, gluten-free is number 1. That's all you need to know here. Everything else is almost kind of secondary. But even if you look at their logo, like if you look at this area of the logo, it's like 1, 2, 3. It's like gluten-free is number 1, their logo is number 2, and then cheddar cheese is number 3. And then you have the picture here. And the picture is kind of leading you up. But anyway, let's get back to the design principles. So we have a hierarchy here. It's not clearly defined, but we know what's most important. Saying what this is, that it's gluten-free snack, is most important. Now let's talk about emphasis, because how do we know that it's the most important? Well, they used emphasis. They emphasized it. How did they emphasize it? Well, they used contrast. Now, where's contrast? There's contrast between the light and the dark. There's a dark, almost like table here that it's sitting on. These things are sitting on a table, and they're kind of off in the distance. And I think that's kind of like a visual kind of trick somewhat, because these crackers are actually the real actual size. But the fact that you're putting them in the distance makes them look like they're bigger for some reason. Like you're looking at them on the edge of a table and they're like this big mountain of stuff, and they put a piece of cheese here, and actually, based on how big these things are, they're about the size of a quarter if you're lucky. So this would be a really small morsel of cheese, even though it looks like a big giant hunk of Swiss cheese or cheddar cheese or whatever it is. So they're kind of making them look bigger and nicer than they are, which they'll always do with food products, because they're not as like tall as this. I mean, they look like, you know how you look at a burger on a picture or billboard and it's like all giant puffed up, and then you get it and it's all flat? Well, these are kind of more flat when you actually get them, and they're a lot smaller than they look here. But anyway, the contrast is leading you in. Your eyes are drawn to contrast. You have dark and light. Now, light's on the top, dark's on the bottom. Why is that? Why would you do that? Sometimes you want to think about how, and sometimes you want to think about why. Well, by putting dark on the bottom and light on the top, what does that remind you of? What does that evoke? The sky, land, sky. That's the way we see things. Table, in front of a window. You know, we usually see darker, more solid objects on the bottom, lighter objects on top. So this is more like a sky. They even have like a sun, like a glow behind here. So it's like you're looking off into the distance, into this window. So you have heaviness on the bottom, lightness on the top. And that's kind of leading your eye up. Your eye's probably coming in here first. You see gluten-free, but also if your eye gravitates on these things, they're going to kind of move up. They're in a pile here that's almost like a triangle. So it's creating like a visual arrow somewhat that's leading you back up here into what they are. So you're kind of led in with the darkness and you're kind of moving up into the bright part. So your eye's going here into the sweet spot. That's where the sweet spot is, the upper third. And this is kind of leading you up here. There's arrows. There's not real arrows, but notice how they're stacked. They're all stacked, so they're kind of leading you up there. Everything is angled to purposely lead your eye up here so you can see, oh, they're gluten-free. And then you kind of read other things, and then whatever you read after that is less important. It doesn't matter. It matters that you pick up the box and you buy it. So they're using contrast to really stand out. That would probably stand out on a shelf next to other types of products around it, so that will get your eyes. Plus, it's very dark up here. We have contrast. We have a very heavy sans serif font with dark color on the light background. That's the highest contrast on the entire box. Everything else is kind of brownish earth tones, and then here they use black, and that really stands out on this background. Everything's kind of warm, but then it even gets light in the middle, so that really pops. And it's a large, clean sans serif font. Not your typical Helvetica. It's a little nicer, has a little bit of rounded edges on it. There's almost slight little edges, like on the end, there's a slight little tiny bit of a serif at the end. I wouldn't call it a serif, but it is a sans serif font. Even as we're looking at this here, in terms of proximity, free and gluten, I mean, they're not only are they close together, but they're almost interlocking. They actually had to shorten the L because that F kind of, that ascender of the F actually pushes into the gluten. That's why sometimes you can't make line spacing too tight because things bump together. Well, they wanted to keep it really tight, but they just kind of shorten the L or kind of, put some kind of overlap over there so that they actually interlock. And it makes a nice little, almost like a logo, because that F fits in that little nook there. It fits nicely, and then it kind of leads you into the other letters. So this gluten-free element of just the two pieces of type actually makes sort of like a logo, and they go together nice. It's interlocking. That F interlocks it. If you just stack the words gluten-free on top of each other, it wouldn't be the same. They kind of go together, and they make this nice little shape here. It's a beautiful little shape that they've done with the letters gluten-free, believe it or not. It's a nice font, and it's a nice little lettering here, and you can see it they even follows down. The L kind of goes down here to the F, and then they actually put a line to lead your eye down there. Now that's alignment, and that's flow. They're aligning things here, and it's making your eye go back down again. So the idea is to keep your eye kind of hovering in here. You see gluten-free, you look at these, your eye staying in this middle area here. If you need to know anything more, you could look around. So we're seeing contrast, we're seeing the emphasis is in here with the high contrast. So you can see how that leads into it. Contrast is creating emphasis. Contrast with the whole box is letting your eye get in there, and then you can get in here more. Now, alignment. Let's talk about alignment. Alignment are in both books, so we'll talk about alignment. What's aligned? Well, I mentioned alignment down here. It's a center-aligned composition. You can see they have gluten-free is centered. They have made with real cheese, cheddar cheese, but it's also centered underneath the gluten-free. So even though this is kind of left to right, you can see they end on the same place here. They're aligned really nice, and they kind of align to the cracker somewhat. The crackers come out just a little bit, but they're still kind of in that nice little margin here. So everything kind of aligns. It's center aligned. You have kind of you almost have like a head and shoulders here. So it's a really nice area here, really nice shape that they're using. healthy shape, big shoulders, narrow waist coming in here, and that's the head. And this stuff's really light. They don't want this to be distracting. They want you to move down and see these crackers. So they use the same colors as the crackers in here, and they even put a little texture. If you zoom in there, there's like little scribbled lines in there, like hand-drawn scribbled lines. And this is really light too. It's picking up some light colors that are maybe back here. So this is kind of dropping off in the background. It's not as important. So when you talk about emphasis, you know, you could emphasize things by making this real dark, but you could de-emphasize things by kind of blending in using the same colors as the background. So that's what's happening next with some of these colors here. But just to finish off with alignment, you can see everything's aligned. As your eye moves down, bite-sized sandwich crackers are aligned. Everything's kind of on the same line. So that's very organized and it's very clean. You know, if you design anything, you want to focus on alignment. So everything's aligned in that area. And this kind of goes left to right because it's kind of balancing off. We'll talk about balance too, but if you put bite size in the middle, there's not a lot of room here, but they put bite size in that little nook there, so your eye could kind of go across here, and then there's just the weight and stuff down here, and they have their little kind of information over here, so it kind of balances off a little bit. They kind of use the space nicely here. It balances off from this too. You have this, you jump from here to here to here. So there's all these things going on, but they really de-emphasized. If you talk about de-emphasizing something, sandwich crackers is really de-emphasized. So they don't want that standing out at all. That's just something they have to have on there, but it's very de-emphasized. You could barely read it, and it's a sans serif font, very narrow, very tall, so it's not very important. Bite size, they have bite size on there, but sandwich crackers, they just have it there just to have it. They didn't want it to interfere with anything else. Because you might say, well, why didn't they put bite-sized sandwich crackers up here? Because then you'd have Lance, gluten-free, bite-sized sandwich crackers made with everything would be together. There'd be too much information in one place. They took the information which could have went here and just put it down here and put it in kind of this empty space down here and just kind of filled up the empty space. They don't have to make it stand out a lot because it's empty. It's an empty area. They're using space. Remember we talked about space, so there's a lot of space down here, so they just kind of put it in there, and it gets attention just by being on its own. There's nothing competing with it. So you got to watch about competing elements. If you tried to put bite-sized sandwich crackers up here, it would compete. You'd have the logo, this, that. You'd have 4 things competing. The fact that they kept it to 3, that's about as far as you could go. And then they broke it up with the crackers and then just put the information down here very subtly. Because it looks different, you know, you have a lot of different things going on. They made it very de-emphasized so you hardly even notice it. So it just almost blends in with the background, but it's there. So it's very subtle, very much sitting back in the background. So again, they do alignment very well. And let's see what else we could think about from HAUS. We talked about hierarchy. We have that in here. Alignment we talked about. Unity. How about unity? Well, there's unity all over this thing because of the color. There's the same colors in the background. There's the same colors. And when I say colors, I mean kind of the family of colors, the same kind of chroma of what's going on. They're all kind of offshoots of this brown, this warm brown color, just lighter versions of it. So everything's kind of in that same warm color, and they kind of borrow from the crackers here. So there's some warm areas, there's a little bit of cool areas, but it all has that same feel. It's like they're using the same palette from the crackers all over this, except for gluten-free, which really stands out. But it's very subtle, kind of glows, very subtle kind of stripes in the background. But that's the unity. And also cheddar cheese is using the same color. Made with Real is using the same color. They're kind of pulling from that background. So they're using the same color palette all over, which is really giving it a sense of unity. That's the unity, is really the color palette, where everything just kind of sits nicely. And where are they getting the dark from? Well, there's some dark shadows there. There's some other darks in here. And that's what really pulls things together. And again, what helps with unity too is having a nice margin around. I guess that would be leading into space. The next one, which would be space, it really uses the space nicely. It has this nice open area and surrounds it with white space. It doesn't look too crowded, even though there's a lot of things going on. And down here, there's a lot of space, like a big open table. It allows your eye to almost come into this 3D space and start moving in and moving up. That's kind of the way your eye comes in. You see gluten-free, but your eyes kind of move in here and move up here. That's how this is like a pointer. The crackers are almost like the pointer that leads you in, but then they lead you back down again. So your eyes really stay in this area here. There's lines like rays of sunlight or something, and they kind of push you. This is pushing you. So everything's kind of leading you into this main area, keeping your eye here, kind of hypnotizing you. Gluten-free, cheddar cheese. Your eyes are staying in this area here, and everything is pointing there very nicely. And again, the colors are very unified. Now finally, space. Now I mentioned space already, so it's using the space nicely, kind of the foreground and the background. So the foreground is leading you into the background, and then this is popping out of it. And that's exactly what they talked about in the Robin Landa book as well. So let's look at repetition. We mentioned repetition as well. What's repeating? Well, colors are repeating so they can create unity. So remember, a lot of these rely on each other. The unity is relying on repetition. They're repeating colors here. What else is being repeated? I don't know if a whole lot's being repeated. I mean, we have a number of elements here, but mainly the colors are being repeated. I'm not even seeing a lot of repetition with the font. There's a slab serif font here, but it's very different looking than this one. They're both slab serifs, but they're very different looking. This has that kind of texture in the middle. And then we have a script font over here, and this is a sans serif. So there's a lot of different things going on, but somehow the colors are what's pulling it together. And it has, again, a really nice use of space, so everything's sitting in this upper, in kind of, your sweet spot here, and then everything's pushed up. And then there's room here in the foreground for all the information you don't really need. So your eyes are just drawn up. Your eyes are drawn up here. This doesn't matter. You're kind of not worrying about the foreground kind of stuff. And finally, after repetition, we have flow. Now, we already mentioned flow because alignment is helping with that, and space is helping flow. This has a triangle type shape that's pushing us up. These things, these lines have flow, so they're pushing us back down again. So it's creating this area in the middle that our eyes go to. We talked about this area almost being like shoulders. There's like a head and shoulders and a waist. It's a very kind of athletic looking shape. Like if this is the head and this is the shoulders, this is the waist, and this is very thin here, it's kind of echoing subliminally almost that kind of, hey, these are good for you, even though they're probably not. I mean, eating cheese crackers probably isn't a good thing for you, but it does have that kind of big shoulder, healthy kind of look here that really kind of stands out. And all these flow kind of things are leading you around. Again, this is kind of a really neat example of flow because it's leading you both ways. The dark color is leading you into the light. Come into the light. This dark color is leading you into the light. And then when you get here, it kind of leads you around and it leads you back down into these crackers again. And then you're hypnotized by all these crackers going, oh, wow, they look so good. And you're seeing all this stuff here. So it's really keeping your eye in there, and it's making you want to pick up the box and grab it. So all that stuff. Hierarchy. We're seeing hierarchy in here of what's most important. We're seeing alignment. They're aligning everything very cleanly, very nicely. Unity. They're using colors to really pull everything together. Space. They're using kind of negative and positive space. Negative space being the table in the foreground. I'd call it more of a foreground background space. The table, there's this table here, and it's making these crackers look really big, even though really they're not. They're really tiny crackers. And this glow in the back is really making everything pop. It's giving emphasis to everything. So as far as HAUS, we got everything going on. We got hierarchy, we got alignment, we got unity, and we got space. So just from those four alone, this is doing kind of a nice job. And as far as ECBARF, we have emphasis. We're seeing all these elements that are emphasizing, and then contrast is helping us emphasize this. The contrast of dark and light on bottom and top. The contrast of using a really dark, large font. We didn't mention that, but look how big this is. Gluten-free is huge. I'm still surprised that the word gluten-free would be used as such a big thing, but if they're trying to get the gluten-free audience, why not just gluten-free? Maybe if you don't have a lot of choices, you're going to gravitate to the things that say gluten-free. So right off the bat, they're just like, hey, gluten-free people, come here and eat these crackers and check them out. So that's kind of working. And emphasis, contrast, alignment, we already mentioned alignment, repetition, it's repeating the colors. Not a lot else is being repeated, although there's a bunch of crackers here, but even the texture is being repeated. There's a texture in here which is kind of evoking the rough texture of this kind of stuff, more of a natural kind of look. And finally, flow. We have, shapes that are leading us to flow. Now, we didn't even talk about design elements like shape and line and stuff, but you could see here that this whole shape is really leading us up to get to this main area. So it's kind of a nice design. It's nice and clean. It uses space well. It's very easy to read. And the things that you want to see and are going to make you grab this product and buy it are there. So I would call this a really nice design, and hopefully I helped you kind of lead through some of these design principles. You can't always follow them, in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because so many of them overlap and rely on each other. But always think about, okay, what's the purpose? What design principles are being used, and how are they being used, and why are they being used? All that stuff you want to think about as much as you can. The more that you do that, the more that you start breaking down designs, whether they're nice designs or they're not very effective, that'll help you when you start design. Because then, if you're doing things that you critique that don't look good, why would you do that? So you want to learn from people that are doing it well. So that's what we're trying to do here. And we're also trying to learn about our design principles so that we can employ them when we start doing more hands-on designs. So that's our critiquing lesson for these gluten-free cheddar cheese sandwich crackers